want to explore the concept of applying policy axioms to ecological policy problems. I found this to be a pretty handy technique to try to unravel and deconstruct some very complicated case studies. Well, just to give you an example, a few examples of the kinds of case studies I'm talking about, one might be the issue of the salmon decline in the Pacific Northwest, including British Columbia and Canada. And another one might be the issue of wildfires and how those might be managed to better reflect societal values. The third area of concern is climate change, particularly those aspects that are caused or perhaps are caused by human activities. Another example might be the issue of the priorities associated with national forests, public lands in general. Example being the debate over spotted owls and listing them under that species under the Endangered Species Act versus using the forest for multiple use, particularly things like logging. Fourth, or another aspect might be the issue of wolves and whether wolves, which were once eradicated in many parts of the contiguous United States, they ought to be reintroduced. There's nothing in science, of course, that says they should or should not, but policies do change, and so now there's a lot of emphasis on reintroduction of wolves. Another example of an ecological policy case is how do you handle issues of whales and whaling? For a long time, whales were harvested like any other animal, conceivably on some kind of a sustainable yield basis. But now there's a lot of political pressure that says, well, whales shouldn't be harvested at all. And so there's no right or wrong here scientifically, but it's a complicated issue because people have strongly held values on all sides of this particular case study. So those are examples of the kinds of ecological policy issues when I reference a policy issue that I'm talking about. Well, let's get direct and practical here. Imagine that you, the scientist, sitting at this table, are presenting the results of your work, or perhaps you're summarizing the scientific literature on some topic to policymakers, the ones sitting on the right at the table. These might be actually representatives from the public, elected officials or appointed officials. They might be senior administrators with government agencies. But in effect, they are the folks who make policy. They make decisions. They reflect a suite of societal values, perhaps interpret the laws, and so on. Well, these case studies that we typically deal with in ecological policy can be extremely complex. And I think sometimes it's very useful to step back from these case studies and look at these issues from the standpoint of what's driving those policies. What are the key issues that can be used to understand what's going on? And that's what we want to focus on today. Well, the first axiom, and there's going to be 9 of these. The first axiom is that the political policy dynamic is effectively has the characteristics of a zero-sum game. And what that means in practice is every policy choice, and there are many choices associated with every case study, involves winners and losers. And depending on the case study and the choices that are available and which choice is selected, there will be a different set of winners and losers. For example, think back to the issue that over the last 30 years in the Pacific Northwest, the spotted owl controversy about national forests and public lands, and what should these forested lands be used for. The surrogate for that issue was really the listing of the spotted owl under terms of the Endangered Species Act, which gave the advocates for the protection of these animals and these forests a strong legal basis. And of course, many of the losers of these various policy options would be associated with rural communities which were dependent on logging activities from the Pacific Northwest. I mean, one of the multiple use standards for national forests is to manage those forests in a way that provides for sustainable economies in rural communities. Nothing right or wrong about that, that's just a goal. But a competing goal is to manage these forests for protection of at-risk species. Hence, the conclusion is if you hear a policy that calls for or says it is win-win, you're not looking deep enough. Every policy choice in policy work involves winners and losers. And so when somebody says, I've got a win-win solution, look at it more carefully. Somehow the losers are being hidden. Second policy action. axiom. The distribution of costs benefits is more important than the ratio of benefits to total costs. What that means is it's not simply a benefit cost analysis and okay, the number is 3, 4, 10, or whatever it is, or less than 1. The question is who receives those benefits and who bears the costs. So when you have a policy debate, it's usually more critical how the distribution of benefits or costs are allocated versus the totality of benefits versus cost. Example, look at the issue of water scarcity and some of the more recent droughts in California. It's been extremely severe, and there's been water shortages up and down the state, particularly in Central Valley and some of the urban areas, and there's been a lot of water constraints. Irrigation is the dominant user of water, and obviously agriculture is an extremely important industry in California and elsewhere. And so the question really is how do you distribute the limited supply of water? I mean, in theory, you can create more water in a sense of more impoundments, but that creates different policy questions. So the question as a policy analyst, one who looks at these policy questions, is who's going to win and who's going to lose given these various policy choices? Axiom 3. The most politically viable policy choice spreads the benefits to a broad majority with the costs limited to a narrow minority of the population. In political terms, we might call this you try to isolate the losers because they're going to vote against your policy, but if it's a small enough number, you'll win, you'll have more votes. So in general, and there's always exceptions, but in general, if a particular policy can spread benefits or people perceive that they're getting a benefit from it, and you limit the costs, limit the losers to a small minority, you can probably win in the electoral process. Example, flood control. Here we have a situation of a very, very severe flood, 1948 in Oregon, although there were floods in 1948 up and down the coast. And of course, one of the things that happened was a city was wiped out, and the pressure was on politicians and others to do something about this. And when you're involved in floods, the first thing that comes to people's mind is you got to control the river. And so a number of dams on the Columbia, where the flood was very bad, a number of dams were built, and very large ones, including 3 exceptionally large ones in British Columbia. And the floods over the last 70 years or so have been much less than the 1948 flood. Now, one of the costs of that was salmon runs were adversely affected. So that's a choice the public has. You can do something about the flooding, i.e. build these dams, or you can keep the dams out and keep the salmon runs much better off. There's no right or wrong here scientifically. It's really a choice. And in some sense, it's democracy in action. What kinds of things does the public want? And what kind of costs, and not necessarily monetary costs, but maybe social costs or value costs and so forth. So it's really a balance. So this is the nasty process of government in action or democracy in action. Axiom 4. Losers, potential losers, are usually more assertive and vocal than potential winners and are therefore tend to be disproportionately important in decision maker. Now this is a slight opposite of the last axiom, and that is even though the number of losers are going to be small, if they're big losers and they're really adversely affected, they tend to be very, very vocal against that particular policy option. So yeah, this has to be balanced about the question of trying to get the votes, trying to distribute the benefits against the intensity of the opposition. And let's use an example, wolf predation. Wolves, there's no question, prey on livestock, they prey on pets, not really affecting humans very often. But fundamentally, if it's your sheep or your dog, you're going to be extremely unhappy, even though the number of people who have sheep and other livestock is relatively small. Numerically, it's not insignificant, and they are very directly adversely affected. In contrast, most of the wolf supporters, broadly speaking, tend to be from urban, suburban areas. They don't tend to be directly affected, and yeah, in some abstract way, they'd like wolves to be reintroduced, but they're not going to be directly affected one way or the other. So this is an example that we have the intensity of policy preference. The guy on the left here is probably extremely unhappy that his sheep were killed by a wolf, whereas the people on the right would say, yeah, they're supportive of wolf reintroduction. It doesn't really affect them, and they perhaps get some psychological or psychic benefit from having wolves reintroduction, but they're not strongly passionate about it. Axiom 5. Advocates, policy advocates, will cloak their arguments in science to mask their personal or organizational policy preference. Advocates don't typically say, I prefer policy X. They will say, I prefer policy X because there's a compelling reason in science that says this is the right one to do, or the scientific information has shown me that this particular option is a much better one than the others. Let's use an example here. Here we have the Sierra Club, and the Sierra Club is clearly an advocacy organization. There's no doubt about it. I mean, they're up front and center that they've got certain policy preferences, and they'll pitch those policy preferences. And so when you read information or science coming from the Sierra Club, anybody's going to say, well, you know, they've got a policy slant, so I'll be cautious. However, another advocacy organization, the American Petroleum Institute, also will use science, and they'll use science to pitch their policy preferences. No surprise. But what about an organization like the Union of Concerned Scientists? I mean, on the surface, at least superficially, a person might say, well, that's scientists. Their goal is to present policy neutral information, just straight up science. But in fact, it's an advocacy group not dissimilar to the Sierra Club. So, but the average person, the average listener, would probably think, well, this is just a straight up scientific group. Not so. So, a consumer of science has to watch for stealth policy advocacy. That is, it's advocacy that is masquerading as science. It looks like, it sounds like science, but it in fact is fundamentally an advocacy tactic used by many advocacy organizations. Axiom 6. Even with complete and accurate scientific information, most policy issues remain divisive. What that means is the fact you can have all the science in the world, you can just stipulate the science, just assume we have all the scientific information on this topic, it will still be a divisive policy issue. For example, let's look at bird mortality associated with wind farms. There's no question that wind farms kill birds and they kill bats and cause some other environmental issues. Nothing right or wrong about that, just a fact in life. However, it's also important that people want electricity. And so if you want electricity, you're going to get it somehow, and all the sources of electricity are going to have effects on environmental aspects. And what about people who use energy for reasons that other people might consider frivolous? For example, in this particular case, we have a doghouse that's air conditioning in a very hot climate. Is that right or wrong? Well, that's not a scientific question. That's purely a policy question. So this axiom essentially means that clashing values, people's priority, mainly drive policy. It's rarely scientific information, and even if we had complete scientific information about a particular case study in ecological policy, it would still be a divisive issue. Axiom 7. Demonizing your opponents by policy advocates, those that support competing policy options, is often more effective than presenting rigorous analytical arguments. There's an analogy here in campaigning. Everybody has discussed it with negative campaigns, but they're used, and they continue to be used because they work. And it's the same thing in policy debates, is people tend to demonize your opponents, not because they feel necessarily particularly good about it, because it tends to work in convincing others to support your policy preference. For example, we have multi-billionaires who advocate for various policy options, and oftentimes this advocacy, depending on whether you're on a political left or right, will mean that the opponents is demonized, and that is, it says, well, not only are his policies wrong, he's fundamentally a bad person because of the following. And this works on from both the left and the right. We tend to demonize opponents rather than pitch our own policy preferences because demonization or negative campaign ads tend to work. Axiom 8. If something can be measured, you've got good scientific data on it, if it can be measured accurately and with confidence, it's probably not particularly relevant to decision making. One of the unfortunate truths, I guess, speaking from a scientific perspective, is that most science is really irrelevant in policymaking. And that's because if we all agree on the science, it's already been stipulated, there's no argument about it, we move on to clashing values or other aspects of contention. So if we've got really good science on a case study, it's probably not all that useful because everybody pretty much accepts it. Let's use an example, predation of salmon. Here we have a salmon being eaten by a marine mammal, and obviously marine mammals, seals, sea lions, eat a large number of salmon. And if you're a salmon advocate, this is not a good thing. If you're a marine mammal advocate, it's just natural course of events. However, there's a lot of push from salmon advocates. We ought to do something about sea lions and seals. And those folks would argue that, in fact, look, they eat a lot of salmon. A lot of those are listed as either threatened or endangered, and therefore we ought to do something about it. The alternative is well, what's more important, sea lion populations, seal populations, or salmon populations? Those aren't scientific questions. They are, in fact, competing values. Hence, more science, clearer science, will not solve this problem because everybody more or less agrees with what the science says. The last axiom, 9. The meaning of words matters greatly, and the arguments over defining those precise meanings are often surrogate arguments over values. And what that means essentially is that oftentimes people don't really want to argue explicitly over values. They want to argue over definitions, which are really surrogates over clashing values. For example, we see a lot of times in science, not in advocacy, well, we see it in advocacy too, but we also see it in science, issues of ecosystem health. People will wrap their policy preference in the term ecosystem health. My policy preference is for a healthy ecosystem. But let's look at an old-growth forest. And here's an old-growth forest operating exactly as an old-growth forest does. A lot of advocates will say this is a healthy forest. If you take that same piece of land, just turn right around and look to the side, identical land, and this forest right here is operating as you'd expect an old-growth forest to operate. We look off on the side and we see essentially the same land, just a different view. It had been recently logged and has been replanted with trees and so on. Is it healthy? Well, obviously it depends what your policy goal is. If you want an old growth forest, the one on the left is healthier. If you want to manage forest, timber harvest, sustainable yield and so forth, the one on the right is healthier. This is what we call normative science, and that is something that looks like science, it sounds like science, it's presented by people who call themselves science, but it is in fact, it has an embedded policy preference. If you call the condition of the ecosystem on the left healthy, that implies that your goal is preservation. If you call the forest on the right healthy, that implies that your goal is sustainable yield. There's nothing right or wrong about either policy preference, but they're not issues of science. They're issues of competing values. Well, axioms aren't miracle workers in the sense of deconstructing policy case studies, but they're a good place to start by understanding the particular issue. The axioms are not set in stone. There are always exceptions to some of them. And so I would be very careful about trying to generalize from them to say this is always the case. It is often the case, typically the case, usually the case, but not always. Good luck with your policy activities.